Penrhyn, North Wales. Diane Pennant, a young mother from North London, is in search of her past. She is going to meet a man whose family once owned her ancestors. It's the first such encounter for more than 200 years. He too is called Pennant. But while Diane lives in a small terraced house, Edmund Douglas Pennant's home is here at Penrhyn Castle, the family's ancestral seat. This meeting will awaken long-buried memories. Penrhyn is built on a single uncomfortable truth.
Nice to meet you.
Very much, yeah.
I'm Diane Pennant.
It's a long time coming.
It's really nice to be here, though.
It's that time, the two ends of the
families met. Yep. When was the last time that a black and white Pennant got together?
1739.
Really?
Both Edmund and Diane are the product of Jamaica's sugar plantations.
What we can actually see is the view here. It's actually in the mist, but there's the Orme there.
About a year ago, I found that my family name was Welsh. That was because I visited South Wales and I looked in a telephone directory and saw a big list of Pennants. So I just, put two and two together and, put it down to, right, then the Pennant name was from a Welsh slave master.
And down there you see that.
Diane and Edmund's families both come from Clarendon in Jamaica. Edmund's ancestors were the largest slave owners on the island.
The weather.
Do you mean where those trees are?
They started on land granted by Charles II. In 2 generations, they'd made a fortune and come home to Wales.
Wow, this is really nice.
Well, here we are. Here is Richard Pennant, the man who took the money from Jamaica and brought it all the way over here, developed these estates. He was an amazing individual, and really, without him, this whole estate wouldn't exist.
And when was that picture taken?
Probably painted about the 1790s.
It's a magnificent room, Edmund.
Yes.
It's really nice. Can I look around?
Yes.
Diane soon picks out evidence of their common background.
This just looks so typical of like a Jamaican craftsman.
The style of it.
Well, there was this way of trying to get some of Jamaica into Penrhyn. I think they did it in a very subtle way to show Penrhyn side, the Jamaica side, into all of this.
Yeah.
The family actually felt Jamaica was a part of them because that first grant in 1670 started the whole of what you see today. I think that is terribly important. The money started out in that one patent of land. So from that little seed grew a huge empire.
Richard Pennant's Jamaican profits transformed this quiet corner of Carnarvonshire. It became the platform for an industrial empire which still stands. He revived a failing local slate quarry. He built roads which are still used. And the boats still dock in the port he founded. By the end of the 18th century, they were masters of a company town. Their success was based on slavery, but with time, that fact was buried under layers of respectability.
A lot of the people today are shocked by what happened in those days. But it's something we have to live with. My family were slave owners. There's not a lot I can do about it. This is a number of pictures.
The main reason Diane is here is to find out more about her slave ancestors. It was they who made Edmund's family rich.
The most important pictures are these. One is Pennant's and one is Denbigh. This is the Denbigh plantation. Shows the plains, the major buildings here. shows how the land was being farmed. And it may be that some of these people, one of these people could be your forebear in here.
Despite their shared name, there is little common ground between them. Diane's family name is Pennant because Edmund's family took her ancestors' names away, as they did with all slaves. Richard Pennant cultivated his possessions like pedigree livestock. He spoke of his slaves in the same breath as he spoke of his cattle.
The health of the Negroes is of the utmost consequence. The children should not be put to hardships that they are not equal to.
That the Negroes and the cattle may have food enough. Care should be taken to have provision grounds and pastures sufficient. Well, this is a letter actually written by Richard Pennant, Lord Penrhyn, to his then agent, which he sent out.
But he had to.
Yes,
I mean, he
course,
had to
yes,
make sure that
yes.
the people working on his plantations were fed
Yes.
good. If
Yes.
not, then there would be no sugar, there'd be no money coming
Yes.
in. You know?
I think it's a sense of sort of guilt there that we treated these people in that way, that one person could own another person.
Diane searches through the slave lists in the family archives, looking for a link to the past. One name leaps out at her, her own.
What's that one? Edward Pennant. Waiting. No, Edward Pennant, waiting boy.
Let's have a look. Edward Pennant, waiting boy.
Healthy boy.
Healthy boy.
Oh, it's a waiting boy.
Well, there is a clue to your actually had family name.
Yeah,
So that could be somebody from whom you descend.
yeah.
There. So that-
We came across a list of slaves on the Pennant plantation, and as we was looking through the list, a name came up as Edward Pennant, who was a waiting boy. Basically, that's all it said about this person, and I wanted more answers. I wanted to know how old he was, who was he a waiting boy for, did he have any children? Is he my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather? But those questions will never be answered.
Diane's story will never be complete. Slavery stripped her family of its history. It gave the Pennants of Penrhyn status and prosperity. Today, Edmund is eager for reconciliation.
The bridge building has got to be between the slave owners and the slaved. It's also got to be between the black Pennants and the white Pennants. I think the contact hasn't been there till these 2 days. So this has been a very historic occasion for everybody, really. We've got to sort of make up 300 years of history here.
The profits from the plantations were to make a profound change in 18th century Britain. Caribbean slave owners helped to transform an agricultural society into the world's first industrial power. Many of Britain's plantation owners were absentee landlords. Richard Pennant ran his operation by letter, dispatched from his Welsh home. The planters constantly sought new technology to help increase their profits. They became heavy backers of Britain's industrial inventions. The steam engine fascinated Richard Pennant. Its inventor, James Watt, heard from his business partner.
Today I dined with Mr. Pennant, who's a very amiable man. He has the largest estate in Jamaica and wishes to see steam in lieu of horses.
Pennant and other plantation owners sent steam engines to the Caribbean. The spread of steam power there accelerated its development here in England. Richard Pennant wanted political power to protect his growing empire. In 1767, he became the MP for Liverpool. In the city, Pennant found like-minded men bent on exploiting Britain's slave trade. They were ruthless. They gambled heavily on the success of slavery and won. Soon Liverpool had surpassed Bristol to become the leading slave port in the world.
I think one has to see the slave trade as a competitive activity, and that in that activity Liverpool would have certain advantages over Bristol. The merchants were perhaps more prepared to take risks. They operated from a port which was less subject to congestion, and the port developed in the 18th century in a substantial way, far more than Bristol did. Therefore, in terms of the pursuit of the slave trade, they were perhaps more ruthless and determined than their rivals from the southern ports.
Liverpool had a deep estuary which could take more and bigger ships than any other English port. They employed young, untrained seamen at low rates, and they undercut their rivals' prices. Opportunistic investors poured into Liverpool. Among the first were the Hayward brothers. They were to become two of the most successful and versatile traders in the city.
Arthur and Benjamin, the name of the two brothers, got into trading in Liverpool. They bought ships and set about becoming merchant traders. And that was the time when they started to be involved in the slave trade. That was the three-way trade where they were sending out manufactured goods from this country to Africa, picking up slaves from Africa going to the West Indies, and then bringing back cotton and wood and sugar from the West Indies back into this country. And that was very, very profitable for the family.
Liverpool grew faster than any British city before it. Everyone from brewers to flour makers prospered, and its population multiplied 15-fold during the century. Its merchants built stately homes. Streets were named after them, and the city honoured those who championed the trade in Parliament. They included royalty, like the Duke of Clarence, who later became King William IV. John Gladstone boasted 2,000 slaves and several ships. His son William later became Prime Minister. By the 1770s, the trade was too big to be financed by wealthy individuals. It needed a new system. Modern banking was about to be born.
The slave and plantation trades were on a new scale, especially as far as long-distance maritime commerce was concerned. So banking, local banking, and also national and international banking had quite new demands placed on it by the slave trade, and they came up in consequence with new solutions.
What happened was that the two brothers who were involved in the slave trade then also started to become involved in banking, saw that as a profitable opportunity.
The Hayward brothers launched a bank which today is part of the Royal Bank of Scotland.
To be able to come into this building, the St Anne Street branch, which I've heard about from when I was a small boy, and to be able to think that this is just one of the institutions that was started by my family, I find very moving. They started off the banking more as just some friends saying, please lend us some money, and then after a few years, it became into a proper banking enterprise in Manchester. And then I think that banking got into the family blood. They were obviously very good at it.
Other merchants followed the Haywards' lead. Today, Barclays, NatWest and HSBC all have roots in the financing of the slave trade.
Insurance also got a really big boost from this area of trade. And in fact, one finds in the city of London that in fact it was often coffee houses that provided the basis of the first banks and the insurance houses, and Lloyd's itself, in fact, did begin life as a coffee house, and it was there that you would be able to get quotations and insure a cargo of slaves from West Africa to the Caribbean.
The Haywards used their money to back innovators like Richard Arkwright. Arkwright transformed manufacturing with his spinning machine. They helped to create a cotton industry which dominated the Northwest for 150 years.
This building here, we're at Ancoats, which is just about half a mile from the centre of Manchester, which is one of the old cotton mills, which was financed by the bank, by my great-great-great-grandfather, Sir Benjamin, in the early 1800s. And this is one of the many cotton mills which were financed by the bank.
Even the cotton spun by these machines was produced by slaves, imported from the plantations of America.
And this was continuing in use up until the 1960s. So for 150 years, this building was in use. And it's fantastic to think that that which was started off again through the Haywood Bank was operating for all that period of time and had such a dramatic impact, together with all the other mills, on the Industrial Revolution in Manchester.
Britain's slave merchants and bankers had kick-started the Industrial Revolution. But to keep it growing, they needed a constant flow of profits from the plantations in the Caribbean. Sugar was the British colony's main crop. European demand exploded, and it became the single most valuable commodity in world trade. Plantations could make profits of up to 200%.
Sugar became the most lucrative agricultural good on the world market. The demand for sugar was increasing rapidly, and the supply was trying to keep up with it. And what we saw was a relationship between sugar and slavery that offered a level of accumulation that the world had not seen before. These slave owners became some of the richest men in the world in the 18th century.
The wealth of the plantation owners depended entirely on the slaves. But in English drawing rooms, few dwelt on the cruelty in the cane fields. And for the bankers, it was just business.
The slave trade was going on out of sight, out of mind. I think it's very likely that my ancestors never even met or saw any of the slaves. They were just over there as part of this trading activity. And so that in no way excuses it, but it does explain the fact that just as a commercial activity at the other side of the world, it was something that they were quite prepared to engage in. And while they were doing it, they were members of society. You know, they were not pariahs at all, and they were considered to be respectable people, providing an honourable service.
Today, the engines which turned the wheels of the plantation system lie silent. The foundations of modern Britain's prosperity lie in these rusting remains, and in a history that until now we've chosen to forget. Over 400 years, 12 million Africans were put on ships bound for the Caribbean and the Americas. Most of those transported were men. During the 6-week crossing, the sick and the dead would be thrown into the sea. Up to half would die within a year of capture. The captain of one of these ships, John Newton, kept a diary.
With our ships, the great object is to be full. There are 3 slave rooms below deck, about 5 feet high, and this height is divided towards the middle, for the slaves lie in 2 rows, one above the other, on each side of the ship, close to each other like books upon a shelf. I have known them so close that the shelf would not easily contain one more. They are kept down by the weather to breathe a hot and corrupted air, sometimes for a week. This, added to the chafing of their irons and the despondency which seizes their spirits when thus confined, soon becomes fatal. And every morning, more than one of the living and the dead are found fastened together.
The slave trade, while being a horrendous experience, and we have now said effectively that the slave trade was a crime against humanity, and we are clear on that. At the same time, it represented the largest movement of humanity in the history of the modern world. It was a phenomenal migration.
On arrival in the Caribbean, the slaves would be washed, oiled, and made to look as healthy as possible. They were expensive. A slave cost around £4,000 in today's terms. experienced planters looked for slaves from tribes they thought were hard-working and docile. Sugar production demanded a scale of organized labor never before attempted. The cane had to be cut, crushed, and milled in just a few weeks, or else it would be useless. Planters needed huge gangs of slaves throughout the year. As the demand grew, they needed more.
By the end of the 18th century, there were around 1 million slaves in the British Caribbean, and that these slaves were working about 3,000 hours a year, completely unrecompensed, because they would grow their own food largely in their own very scant spare time. So there were 3,000 hours, 1 million slaves, that's 3,000 million hours spent producing sugar, spent producing coffee, spent producing cotton.
On the plantations, men and women were separated and given new names. Conditions were harsh. The average slave would survive just 8 years. The regime was brutal. Those who refused to work were flogged by the especially appointed punishment slave. Persistent runaways had their limbs amputated. Some might have their orifices packed with gunpowder. Planters would compete to light the fuse in an entertainment they called putting a little powder in the arse of a nigger. Thomas Thistlewood, a plantation manager, kept a diary.
Put Hazat in the bilboes, gagged him, locked his hands together, rubbed him with molasses and exposed him naked to the flies all day and to the mosquitoes all night.
There was little hope of escape. Even though the planter was in a minority, he knew that there was a formidable backup. The profits of the Caribbean and the Americas drew in rival European powers. They were constantly at war, and their military garrisons doubled as the guardians of the plantocracy.
But we need to recognize that slavery was maintained in the West Indies as a result of the most formidable system of imperial authority. 6 or so European nations, all developing empires, massive military buildup in this region, and slaves were kept in a form of suppression, not only by the white communities and the societies, but it was the wider military significance of their presence here.
In this siege society, slaves had no rights. The planters even attempted to suppress family life.
As soon as sugar and slavery expanded, and planters could replenish the labor force through constant importations, then they became less careful about selecting slaves so that the ratios would be equal. They became more callous about slave relationships, and so families were not encouraged.
Planters routinely abused their slaves. Some masters regarded sex as their natural right. Rape was common, as Thomas Thistlewood wrote.
Tuesday, 10th September 1751, about 10:30 a.m., with Flora, a Congo woman, on the ground among the canes. She'd been for watercress. I gave her 4 bits. About 2 a.m., with Negro girl, on the floor in the east parlour. Thursday, 20th October, with Sally at the foot of the cotton tree, but not good.
Apart from their white families, planters often kept a second household with a slave mistress. The children from these liaisons would grow up with a privileged status.
The interesting thing about slavery is that mixed-race slaves tended to be the ones in the house. So domestic slaves were usually young, female, Creole, colored. But sometimes the children were freed by their white fathers. And I should say also that white women also had children by black men, by enslaved men. And because the status was passed on from mother to child, those children were automatically free.
The last 2 centuries have brought descendants of slaves and slave owners to Britain. The racial mixing then has left many Britons now curious about their origins. It's a puzzle they're determined to solve. Robert Beckford is a teacher of theology born in England. His family comes from Jamaica. He's never been there and knows little of the family history. But he's about to set out on a journey into his own past.
I'm very proud of being Jamaican, and that pride was passed on to me by my parents. But there's also another side of me, which is British. I speak English. I was educated in English schools and institutions, and many of my likes and dislikes are shaped from being black in Britain. The church is important to me. It's a community. It's one of the few places where people who are black can move, shout, sing, and be in a safe space.
But he knows that it's unlikely that all his ancestors were black.
Knowing a little bit more about the history of the Caribbean, then I suppose there is a possibility that I, like many African Caribbean people, have white ancestors. My father told me that we have a blood lineage to a white Beckford family. From the little that I know so far, they were a large slave-holding family in the Caribbean who were successful and, as a consequence, were able to build large houses in England. How I feel about that at the moment is that they represent the oppressors within my family history. We've got this family who really were able to exploit my side of the family and live very well off it. And from what I know about the history of slavery, we didn't get too much pay then, and are still waiting for the back taxes now, you know?
Nether Hayford, a small village near Northampton. This is the heart of Middle England. Janet and Mick Randall have lived here all their married life. Janet has recently discovered some old papers, which have made her look back into her family history.
From 2 years old, I remember just my grandfather and my parents, and we lived at the cottage. And really, my grandfather brought me up a lot of the time because my mother went to work, my father obviously, and my grandfather and I were very close. Here's William Henry, my grandfather, when he was young. I met my grandmother.
Good-looking chap.
And there's another one there of him. That one he actually gave to my grandmother. In his young days, he was quite a dish. Actually, he really was. And I think that's why my grandmother fell for him, because Herb, with being a Catholic upbringing and very strict family life, she absolutely loved him. She was fascinated by him, and she thought, when he was young especially, obviously, he was absolutely wonderful. And he was always dressed to the nines. He absolutely adored clothes. He had suits galore, silk shirts. He was always that kind of person with his cane. There's his mother with his 2 sisters.
It stood up well for its age, isn't it, the picture? It was done in Bridgetown.
My grandfather was half coloured. He wasn't black, but he was part coloured. And if I'm truthful, when I was young, I never even noticed he was. I can't even say to you that I even noticed it. It was not until I probably was 15, 16, and anybody made comments to me that I even really noticed that he was coloured at all.
Well, Janet always said that he was coloured, but he never made a big issue of it. And it wasn't till somebody at work says, "You know Janet's grandfather is black." And I says, "No, I didn't know." And I said, "I've seen photos," and I says, and he was, according to what I've heard, he was really liked by everybody. So I says, what does it matter?
And here's my father. He was the youngest of the family. I don't really feel there's anything coloured to do with me. Even though I know there is, I don't really feel that there is, because I've always had a British way of life. Obviously, my mother was white. My father was only very slightly, obviously, coloured whatsoever. And so the point is, I've never felt that I was anything but British.
Janet Randall and Robert Beckford know that they have roots on these Caribbean shores, and they are both about to discover their own bonds to the history of slavery. Robert Beckford is in Jamaica for the first time. He's looking for evidence of his white ancestors. First, he has to bridge a generation gap with his own father.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Daddy.
How's everything?
Not too bad, not too bad. Good to see you.
Nice to
Good
meet
to
you.
see you.
Long time I haven't seen you.
I know.
Long time I haven't seen you.
I know, but you look well though.
Yes, well it seems like you're not going to get married at all. Because you still turn up without a wife. And this is Maud, my cousin.
Good to see you, Maud. Maud, good to see you.
Thank you.
And this is your sister?
That's
I'm
my
good,
sister.
I'm good. Well,
Yeah.
good to see you. All right. Daddy, I remember when I was 14, we'd just finished watching an episode of Roots, and I asked you where our family came from, and you told me that one of our relatives, just a couple of generations back, was white. Is that right?
Yeah. My grandfather, my great-grandfather is white.
Could you tell me anything else about him?
His father was a slave master from England. So he came to Hillsbrook in Hanover and he bought some property there.
How do you feel about having a great-grandfather who was white from England and the son of a slave owner?
We was very proud.
We was very proud, and we're still proud about
And
it.
of
Because,
course,
you know,
we do.
we're proud to know that our ancestors was of different race.
Yeah.
And because they was white, they was successful people. And then we grew up, we want to be successful too.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud to be a Beckford.
Yes.
Because they're honest working class people, very honest people, like to be on top, like to be leaders,
Yes.
like to be people to respect them.
Do you think, therefore, it's worth me keeping the Beckford name despite it being a slave name?
Yes, keep that name.
Keep that name.
Why? Tell me why you think I should.
Because there is our grandparents.
It's our grandparents.
And then they grows up the right way.
Yes,
You see?
they taught us to respect
people.
People and respect the family. And we come up, you will hear us say,
The amazing thing about talking to Len and Maud was that they were so positive about the Beckford name. They seemed to feel it was a really good thing for them to have. And in particular, the fact that they had a great-grandfather who was white was a real prestige for them. They felt, it was a really good thing. It made me feel rather uncomfortable. I felt that they were really living out a Jamaican fantasy, being very dark-skinned people, but being able to claim to have a light or white great-grandfather. That doesn't necessarily work the same way for me in England, because I don't have that kind of need to be able to say I had a great-grandfather who was white and feel that that's going to bring me some kind of benefit in the present.
Janet Randall is in Barbados hoping to find her family. She knows her grandfather came from this island and that his name was Ward.
When I lost my parents about 20 years ago, I just had a thing that I wanted to go back because I knew that I got relatives over there. And I just realised that there was just another side to my grandfather's life.
She has found that in Barbados there are many people called Ward, and that they all belong to the same extended family.
You were here in Barbados to search for your ancestry.
That's right, yes. Would you like me to show you some photographs
Yes, thank you.
that I've brought with me?
The family's oldest members are Roy and Louis.
Well,
This is family.
that
Yeah.
is William Christopher Ward.
William Christopher, yeah.
Yeah, my great-grandfather.
Yeah, that's good. That's all right. That'd be good. But the features don't hide, you know. I mean, they come out.
Both of these are William.
Yeah.
She has her father's eyes.
Yeah. So I put him there.
That's my grandfather, yeah.
Roy and Louis quickly spot a family resemblance.
I think that there's a resemblance of my grandfather somewhere along here, Roy. Here.
Yeah, well, there, yes.
The eyes, okay? This is my grandfather.
Yes, it certainly looks as if there's a resemblance there, doesn't it?
So if you look at it closely, you will see that.
Yes, yes.
The only thing is
Looks
that.
a very
But the only thing about it is that he has a full beard.
Yeah.
So there is a resemblance. And here is my father, who, of course, is a mixture.
Yeah.
Like your grandfather.
My grandfather, yes.
You know, but then you can still see the resemblance.
I can see probably my uncle, actually. And that's, yes, there's certainly a resemblance.
See, so I'm saying that there's a resemblance, but we cannot put our fingers on it
Yeah.
to say, well, this, you know, are so closely connected or whatever. But I still maintain that there's a connection. And as I told Roy just now, I said, all wars are related.
Yes, somewhere along the line.
Because if you look at you,
Yeah.
you wouldn't think that you have colour than you.
Not to look at me, no, but I've always known, you see, so it's never
Exactly.
meant anything to me.
You see, you don't see it.
No.
You know,
No.
When I met you, I was looking for a darker person.
Oh.
Basically, she has the white features.
Yeah, white features, yeah.
She has not Negroid features.
Oh, no.
So that's what I'm saying.
Roy, Louis and Janet are all convinced that they could be part of the same family.
Looking at those photographs was looking like at members of your own family because there's so much resemblance to your own father and uncles and even my cousins, actually.
But now Janet wants to know for certain where her family line began.
So I'd like to know the story, really, as far as you can go back. I don't know how far we actually can, but I'd like to know as far as I can go.
In Jamaica, Robert's been talking to Douglas Hall, a Jamaican historian. Hall is an expert on the slave-owning Beckfords.
How significant then were the Beckfords in relation to the history of Jamaica?
Oh, very important in the 18th century. Very important. Most of them who were here were at one time or another members of the assembly, and they held all sorts of official positions and so forth. Please, let me show you though where the main concentrations were. When they first arrived, they settled nearer to Kingston or Port Royal, around this area, St. Catherine, Clarendon, you know. Then they moved this way, out into this area, several miles down in here, and they moved into this area, and that is where the best sugar estates were.
These plantations are still the most productive in Jamaica. Thousands of slaves lived and died here. It's certain that Robert's ancestors were among them, but could he also be descended from the owners themselves?
My father and my aunt have told me that my great-great-grandfather was a white Beckford called James Beckford who lived in Westmoreland and purchased land there. Would it be fair to say that this Beckford was related to one of the major white Beckford families?
Very likely. If you look at the telephone directory in Jamaica, you will find that there are about, I think it's about 400 Beckfords listed in Westmoreland and in the country areas. It's a considerable number. And I suspect that, yes, that most of these are in some ways, maybe not in terms of paternity, but in terms of association. The names derive from
related.
Janet already knows from her grandfather's letters that his mother's name was Malvina. In the Barbados Records Office, she searches through the lists of births and marriages.
And now you look across here and see where you can find them out in the alphabet.
Ward, yes, and then down. I see.
This way.
She finds her black great-grandmother Malvina and her white great-grandfather. They were married less than 30 years after slavery ended.
Malvina Catherine.
A little louder, please.
William Christopher Ward. This is when they were married, and it was on the 29th of August, 1865, in Barbados, St. Lucie.
Malvina's birth certificate takes her back another generation.
And Andrews, Malvina Catherine. And this obviously was her baptism, wasn't it?
Yeah, baptism, ready.
Yes. 11th of April, 1838, in Barbados and St. Lucie.
Correct.
You're doing wonderful to find all this, lot. You must be good at it.
This is volume 48, page 1. Here we found...
This certificate shows the marriage of Janet's great-great-grandparents. Both of them were black.
This was his parents. They were Andrews.
Her family line now goes right back into the days of slavery.
Marvellous. Marriage solemnised at the parish of St. James in the island of Barbados in the year 1825. William Andrews of St. Lucie Parish and Catherine Jane Lawless, of the St. James Parish were married in this church by licence this 3rd day of November in the year 1825.
The discovery leaves Janet reflecting on the huge gap between her life and that of her newly found slave ancestors.
I do find it very far removed from me because it's so way back, and I've always lived a privileged white life, always. And so how can I really feel what they felt? I can't. And even though I can see it and I can understand it, I obviously can't feel it. I can just feel for them.
While Janet has finally found her black forebears, Robert is still looking for his white ancestors. Rose Hall shows how the plantation-owning Beckfords would have lived in the 18th century.
Well, it reveals the kind of profits and money that was generated from the slave trade and the lifestyle that the people were able to live. As a result, the slave owners lived a fantastic lifestyle.
Jamaica's Anglican Cathedral is the White Beckfords' last resting place. The family enslaved thousands of Africans, Robert's ancestors among them. Robert's Christian faith tells him that he should try to reconcile himself with the slave owners. But he finds that a Jamaican church still gives slave masters pride of place.
I felt really angry. I wanted to spit on the grave because these people represent the oppression of my people. They're the ones who worked my ancestors to death, raped many of the women, and then had the audacity to, get buried in the front of a church. And it kind of reveals the church's complicity with the terror of slavery. By having them buried there at the front, it somehow, it kind of cleans up, purifies the wickedness that actually took place.
The past few days in Barbados have changed Janet's perception of the origins of her family and of others.
Having now searched and found all the history of my ancestors, I feel much closer to them, and I can now relate more to them than I obviously did before, and especially to my grandfather. I do realise that quite a lot of my family would have been slaves in any case, yes. The coloured side especially, and there would have been many. I'm sure that there's many white people who obviously do not have any clue that they must have some coloured connection, because unless you look way back, and throughout the world, not just the Caribbean islands, throughout the world, this has to be true. But where the slavery connection is, I do feel that they probably wouldn't want to know. They prefer to... It's a hurtful subject, and they would prefer not to know.
The one thing Robert has not yet seen is how his slave ancestors would have lived.
I was walking over here and just acknowledging that this is where my ancestors lived and that their spirits live on. And as I walked over here, I said to them that I can forgive, but I can never forget. On the one hand, this represents a site of labor, forced labor by my African ancestors. But on the other hand, it also represents a space of resistance, because people made it through this. I'm here today and able to tell their story, but I can't help but be overwhelmed by a sense of sadness. So, mixed feelings, but more sorrow than celebration.
Robert's quest now is to find the contribution of his black ancestors to the overthrow of slavery. He will discover that the cruelest blows were dealt in its final hours.